and welcome to the EMS On Air podcast. The mission of this podcast is to keep healthcare providers safe, informed, and prepared. Today is February 9, 2021. This episode was recorded on January 11, 2021. I'm Jeff Lassers, and I'll be your host. Even though we're located in Southeast Michigan, and we mention our home state a lot, today's content applies to EMS on the national and even the global scale. In this episode, we're going to talk about something that's a little bit uncomfortable for most people. It's something we all do, but we don't like to talk about it because it might make us feel ashamed or feel guilty. Or maybe we don't want to talk about it because it might damage our reputation or a fragile ego. I'm talking about making a mistake. Every single person that will ever listen to this podcast has made or will make a mistake at some point in their life and all of their careers. This is especially true for EMS providers because the imperfect world of emergency services is inherently fraught with the potential for error. Being an EMS provider means taking care of people that are sick and or injured in an environment that is in a constant state of unknown and or change. That is not exactly a set of conditions that lends itself to a mistake-free system. Remember, mistakes happen and you're only human. What matters is what we do after we make a mistake. Today, we welcome back Emily Bergquist, the Medical Control Authority Coordinator for the State of Michigan Bureau of EMS Trauma and Preparedness. She is the one at the State of Michigan EMS office that works on all of the protocols and provides support to assure that the multitude of Michigan's EMS systems function the way that they're supposed to. In addition, Emily spends quite a bit of time investigating situations where an EMS provider, a crew, and or an agency has made a mistake. Emily is here to give us her professional advice regarding the best practices an EMS provider should take after making a mistake, either on or off duty. If you want to contact Emily, you can find her email in the episode description. Please keep emailing your questions, comments, feedback, and episode ideas to the EMS On Air podcast team by email at qi@ocmca.org. Also, check out our website, emsonair.com, for the latest information, podcast episodes, and other details. And please, whatever podcast platform you listen to, subscribe to our podcast and leave us a rating and a review because it really helps us to grow this project. Thank you and enjoy the episode. Good morning, Emily Bergquist. How are you?
I am good, Jeff. How are you? Happy Monday.
Good. Happy Monday. Here we are talking about something fun on a Monday. Before we go on, you have been here before, but please, for those people who have not had a chance to hear an episode with you in it before, can you tell everybody who you are, what you do, and where you do it?
Well, I'm Emily Bergquist, and I am the Medical Control Authority Coordinator for the Bureau of EMS Trauma and Preparedness, specifically the EMS section. What that means is I work with all the clinical and operational protocols around the state, kind of supporting the medical control authorities in their work and making sure that everyone's doing the most evidence-based practices that we can in EMS in Michigan. And I do it currently at my house in Lansing. But during normal times, whatever those are, I do it at our office in Lansing, Michigan, which is kind of up by the airport.
And Lansing, for those of you who don't know, is our state capital city. And that's where Emily's going to be located. But like she said, she's at home somewhere around the mid-mitten right now, having a good time.
Yep.
So, Emily, you're here to talk about doing the right thing, mistakes. And really, I think the overall theme for today is people aren't perfect. We tend to make mistakes because we're human. We have errors. As EMS providers, mistakes can happen on a variety of things. I can give the wrong med. I could transport to the wrong hospital. I could do the incorrect procedure, or I might not do a procedure that I should have done, which could turn into a bad outcome. Now, those are things that are on duty or on calls. And then I could also do things like, I don't know, maybe get a driving while impaired or have some type of legal issue that is unrelated to my work. Bottom line is people aren't perfect. People make mistakes. People find themselves into trouble sometimes. And that's okay. But I think the number one thing, what people do after they make a mistake, is the number one thing that leads to what's going to happen to them, their careers, and really what goes on with them. So I think to kick this off, you're really here from the state's perspective as to your view as the state of Michigan EMS office when people make mistakes is to really tell people, what do they, the state, or that governing body do, think, feel? Because you're not a machine, you're not a computer, and you have to look at all these humans that potentially make mistakes. So, can you give us a little bit and appreciate the value of doing the right thing after making a mistake?
Sure. And I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head, Jeff, in saying that we are humans. All of us are humans. And everybody who will deal with you in the state office have all been clinical providers at some point in time, some of us more recently than others. But we understand that, especially in EMS, it's a chaotic environment. There's a lot to remember. Some things you do very, very infrequently. And all of those things kind of play into when and if mistakes happen and what we're going to do about it. I think the thing about doing the right thing is being honest about it. Integrity in EMS, I think probably at your MCA level and also at the state level, it goes a long way. So if you have an error, if you have a mistake, if something didn't happen the way that you thought it should or the way you knew it should, it's important to say, hey, this happened and this is why I think it happened, and be honest and forthright about it. And that goes on like every side of the coin. So it's clinical, it's criminal, it's, any sort of situation like that, because covering it up or lying about it is not going to get you anywhere. And the other piece of it is, if for no other reason, EMS is a small world and somebody is going to find about it sometime. And then it's going to be, you had a mistake and then you lied. And when you lie or cover up or lie by omission or whatever you want to call it, it makes everyone suspicious of pretty much everything you've ever done. So if you would have this mistake and cover it up once, how many other things have you had that you've covered up? So I cannot reiterate enough how important it is for you as a provider to take your licks, give honest recollections of what has happened, be clear, and know that we do understand that you're a human. We're all human. So honesty takes you a long way towards reconciliation for whatever the issue was.
I think for me, admitting you have a problem is the first step in recovery.
I don't have a problem. Just kidding.
You know what I mean, though? Like recognizing,
I do.
oh, I do have a problem. Maybe that was a single event problem where I made a single mistake, or it's an ongoing thing. But recognizing it and being okay with the fact that what I did and what I'm supposed to do are not congruent.
So this is something I think that is probably a good thing to talk about too, is that a lot of times when a provider, I'm going to call licensees providers for our conversation because you understand what I mean, has an issue that goes on, and then they come and they sit in front of us when we start asking them questions about it, and we will ask clinical questions that assess your competency about whatever that particular problem was. A lot of times when we start talking to them, they have an epiphany in that moment that, holy smokes, what I did was actually really wrong, and I should have remembered that from school or whatever. So that's another thing. Once you have this particular error, go back to your textbooks and articles and do some reading about, if somebody says you had a problem that involved an abdominal pain patient, don't go into the meeting going, well, I don't really know what I did wrong. Go and look and see, what are we supposed to do for an abdominal pain patient? And then you'll probably figure it out pretty quick, because that's where a lot of our, errors happen, is something that somebody forgot from school.
From a protocol as well, where they either they misremembered when a protocol was updated and doing something. Oh, I forgot that was updated.
Right. Exactly. Or I forgot that the wording was if then, not always do.
So I think the immediate response you're saying is to take that ownership as a provider, right? And then to go back and look at what does the rule say, and then what does the foundational information say from the textbooks or whatever information you're going to pull from.
And I think that, there's the I know I did it, right? So there's the I know I did it, which we'll throw out the ones they talk about in school, right? I've never actually seen anybody do this. The adenosine versus atropine. That's one I actually haven't seen. But in school, they talked about that a lot, right? A medication error, where you give the medicine and then all of a sudden you're like, oh no, that was the wrong medicine. So that's
like in the moment.
In the moment, you realize, so you know you did it wrong, and you know you gave the patient a wrong medicine. You need to, immediately, hopefully there's not some sort of huge bad outcome happening right in that moment, but you need to make sure that the hospital knows, you need to make sure that your agency knows, and you need to make sure the MCA knows so that you can take care of the situation as it arises so that it doesn't compound. If you give a patient a medicine that they should not have had, and then you don't tell anybody about it, there can be a lot of other worse outcomes from it. So that's like one kind. You did it in the moment. You knew it was wrong. And then the other kind is like you're coming up on something. Somebody says there's a complaint against you, there's a run review, etc. You were like, oh, I didn't really know that was a problem. I don't understand what they would want me to do. That's the kind that I think when you know that that's whatever kind of run. I'm throwing out abdominal pain because it's like something we see all of the time. This is an abdominal pain run. These are the things I did. Go back and compare it to the things that you should be holding yourself against, which is your educational standards, your protocols, your scope of practice, those things. Go back and look at those and say, where maybe didn't my treatment measure up?
Agreed. So the best practice after making a mistake initially for you is, number one, own it. Number two, be honest about what you know and what you don't know. Be reasonable about the feedback, right? And then be accountable for the future.
And it's very disheartening. So, I mean, inevitably, if something happens, and not even with a bad outcome, just sometimes big things happen that don't have bad outcomes, that we will end up talking to you. If we say to you, hey, what have you learned from this? And you say, well, not really anything. And we say, did you go back and review these things? And you say, well, no. And people do that. It's really difficult to have a lot of empathy for the person in that situation, because I would be lying if I said I have never made a mistake. And I would be lying if I said that there are things that I learned on the fly working as a paramedic. But the key point to it is that you have to learn from those things and take them with you. So I can use an example of, I had a patient one time that had Menkes kinky hair disease. I had no idea what that was or what it meant for anything. And it's a super rare genetic condition. But now I know a lot about Menkes kinky hair disease, because when I was in that situation, I was like, I never want to feel this way again. I don't want to not know. And so you have to take some ownness, some stewardship for yourself and your own license, that if there's a medicine that a patient's on or a condition that a patient has, or, fill in the blank, you can learn about it yourself. Like, you don't have to be, I don't want to use the word spoon fed, but you don't have to be led everywhere. Take some initiative. And if you feel uncomfortable or something was weird, go out and seek that information yourself.
So you're talking about somebody with an intrinsic motivation to recognize that there might be something that needs to be learned, and then going out and learning it. And I don't think that those are the people that tend to make as many mistakes that you need to, quote, worry about. These are people that I think are that top 10% who are already going to identify, what are my problems? How do I get better? And then you got the next 80% that I think I'm worried about that need to be more informed.
So there's
the bottom 10%, we're not going to fix them. They suck. You know who you are. You're probably not listening to this podcast if you're in the bottom 10%.
That is probably true.
So I'm talking.
I will say that there are some people who also think that there's a point, right? There's an edge line of, I should say, the intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation in EMS doesn't enable you to be able to make up your own treatments.
Agreed. A lot of people tend to, yeah. Okay. So let's back up and talk about the applicable laws. Can you please list and describe any applicable laws, protocols, or related rules that require an EMS provider to take any specific types of actions after making a mistake or breaking a law? In general, could be on duty or off duty. So kind of give us a flyover there.
So there's a specific protocol for the criminal pieces of it that says you have to report to your MCA when you have been even arrested, so that your MCA is aware of the particular situation.
Not your agency?
Honestly, not in any of our rules. Your agency might have a policy. I assume they do, but it's not in our rules that you have to report to your agency. It's in our rules that you have to, it's in our protocols, I should say. That you have
so
to
for the
report.
context of the conversation then, assuming that your HR departments, if you have one, and
presumably you should report it to your agency. You should also report it to our office. And on the second piece of it, if for some reason there's a situation during your relicense, like your renewal period, and you go to renew and it asks about whether or not you've been convicted, as an FYI, we do check. And even if you have talked to us about it, you still have to check the box that yes, you were convicted, right? You can't lie and say, no, I wasn't, because then again, we go back to that first part about integrity and lying. And if you sign a legal document that says you weren't convicted and you were, that's fraud. So now you're in a whole other piece of work. So yes, you do have to report to us. And I think now is a good time to say, like, the standards for which you're held, and the law says you have to perform in a manner consistent with your education, licensure, and approved medical control authority protocols. It's 333.20958. I pulled it up specifically so I would have it here. That particular piece is under the authority that we take all action against licenses. And it does say your education. And so, yes, sometimes we have had to go back and pull educational standards and say, yeah, maybe it doesn't say in the protocol, I'm trying to think of something obscure, that you should palpate an abdomen, for example. It might not say every specific thing that a provider has to do, because otherwise our protocols would be textbooks, right? They would be 1,000 pages long, and they're already pretty long. But we have to know that you're held to that forever and ever and ever, the educational standards. So, like, if I went to paramedic school in the year 2000, just guess what? I am held to the same standard as somebody who just graduated. That's our scope of practice. That's important.
Now, because you keep kind of, in my mind, based on what I'm hearing, you're talking about the initial education training, but are you also referring to the ongoing training that could be or should be happening at these agency levels that should be maintaining this high degree of ability? Or are you saying this is all the responsibility of the EMS provider?
So agencies have to attest to the competency of their providers. So that's the agency's responsibility. So the agency, I'm not saying an agency must provide the education, right? Like, I can't say that Bud's ambulance service has to provide a specific amount of education, but they do have to prove competency. So when an agency is inspected, they will ask to see their records that prove that their people are competent. So if, for example, something happens, the agency can also be held accountable for the lack of competency of their providers. So that's one piece. That's the agency's responsibility in that. And then the second piece of it is you have your own license, right? This is what's really weird. Our licenses are not actually dependent upon somebody else's. So we have our own license, and that includes like EMTs when they're working with paramedics. Everybody is responsible up to the level of their license. So if the mistake that was made or error that occurred happened at the EMT level, the EMT is also held accountable for that. So, yes. And you have to keep up with your stuff. People think continuing education means the same stuff over and over again. For example, bloodborne pathogen training or infection prevention or compliance. These are the things that you do every single year.
Well, I don't know. In 2020, we had like a whole fresh set of, bloodborne pathogen training. It's got a lot more updated, huh?
Think about how lackadaisical we all were about infection prevention. Like, when did we use respiratory precautions? TB patients, right? TB patients, bacterial meningitis, and that was it.
Yeah, like known, and then I go to a nursing home, and there's a big pink card on the door that says respiratory protection.
Exactly.
Even if I don't know how to even pronounce the word on the piece of paper, I just put it on, right? It was only when it was like flashing, put on
or
your
like
respiratory
fever,
protection.
productive cough, weight loss. We all know like the TB signs and symptoms, congregate living settings, et cetera, et cetera. But could we have been better about it? For sure, we could have been better about it. There have been a lot of diseases, like take, for example, Ebola, that have come and bit us in the butt, per se, EMS-wise, because we had been doing the status quo. So, the same old trainings, literally, recorded trainings with the same PowerPoint presentations, with the same quiz questions at the end that check your box, that stinks. That's Emily's opinion on this, but if you're a paramedic and you've been a paramedic for a really long time, I mean, like, I didn't really learn Untitled CO2 when I was in school, right? Because I'm old. But I helped develop the trainings when we got Untitled CO2 at my agency. So I learned a whole lot about it. But there are people out there that I'm sure still don't feel comfortable with this newfangled tool because they went to school 20 years ago or longer. But it's their responsibility to raise their level of knowledge to the same as someone coming out of school right now, because that's the standard. That's the standard that we're all held to. I could say the same thing about 12-lead EKGs, right? When I started, we didn't have 12-lead EKGs. We had LifePak 10s, which doesn't make me, I didn't use LifePak 5s or whatever, but if you wanted to do a 12-lead EKG, you had to move all the wires around, and create the positive and negatives and blah, blah, blah. Well, do you think that I had the 12-lead EKG training if that's what it was? For sure not. But did I have to bring myself up to that because it's the standard of care? Sure, I did. And that's my responsibility to make sure that I am competent in that. And it's my agency's responsibility to verify my competency in that.
So how do you...
Talked about that for a long time. Sorry, Jeff.
No, I like that a lot because I think you're bringing up the fact that if you were to do those things, you're probably not going to have reportable problems because you're probably going to have a process of educating, measuring, evaluating, and number one above all those is dialogue between the agency personnel that are measuring and evaluating every call and outcome, and then the personnel actually going on calls. If that dialogue's not there, you're not going to prove anything. On top of that, you're kind of saying, hey, if I do all these things, I'm probably going to be fixing my problems along the way and be pretty well prepared for all the stuff downstream. Well, that's not even law. That's just best practices as a business person. Take EMS, put anything else in here. We're talking about identifying rate limiting steps and personnel that may need additional information to do their job better. That's really what we're talking about here. But really, when it gets to the gray area, I have found that the most mistakes occur of unknowing when there is a balance between an unknowing at the agency administration level and the people going on the calls level. Believe it or not, Emily, there are agencies out there in the world of EMS, not Michigan, not Oakland County, in the world, the whole world of EMS. There are people running EMS agencies who are not good at their job and who are not good at dialogue and who do not know how to do a QI program, may have egos in the way. Whatever the reasons are there, those disenfranchised groups sometimes have a situation where the people going on calls think they're doing the right thing. And then the administration thinks, well, these people need to follow their protocols. And when a problem occurs, they then tell somebody else about it rather than having a prevention program. That's where the biggest concern for me comes from, because everybody has this diffusion of responsibility. And in that situation, there's nobody measuring anything. There's just people going on calls. That's dangerous. Can you kind of talk about some problems there that you could foresee that might be something that you could handle?
So you used the word responsibility, and that is a key word in this, is that in our EMS system in the state of Michigan, everyone shares the responsibility. It is not a pure, so like med legal says, respondeat superior. I don't know, it's a kind of a weird term that is legal term. That means that the person who is highest up that knew about it is responsible for it. That doesn't mean that everybody doesn't have a share. So it might be, 80, 10, 5, 5, depending on who all is involved. So everybody has a piece. So that's why when you see actions taken, remediations, consent orders, suspensions, revocations, whatever they happen to be, it's not usually just one person that's seeing something, because we have checks and balances in our system, right? Me, my partner, my agency, my supervisors, the medical control authority, and then the state office. And all of those pieces have a responsibility to make sure that things are happening safely, appropriately, and to the standard. So by the time your responsibility, quote unquote, fails, I don't mean intentionally, but it fails because something happens. Say you give the wrong medicine, but you didn't do a medication cross-check with your partner. Okay, so your partner's also a paramedic and they were there with you when you gave this medicine. There's a little bit of responsibility shared there. Your agency hasn't implemented any sort of cross-check procedure or any sort of verification for giving high-risk medications in real time. They have a little bit of responsibility. We as the state office have not managed to get a protocol together, honest to God, that's not like 7 pages long about a medication cross-check. So there's a shared responsibility for us too, because we've been working on it and we can't seem to get it. I'm reading this book about checklists to try to get ourselves better off, but this is the thing about sharing responsibility. So if there's a medication error, we're probably not going to ship you off the river and take your license forever, unless, of course, you're like, intentionally gave them 500 milligrams of ketamine because you didn't like them. That's different. That's not a medication error. That's assault. So, or possibly homicide, pending.
Right.
But that's the key point, is responsibility between everyone involved in the situation. And so I think that also goes to the reporting piece. I'm just going to touch back on that again. If you are a partner and you see someone doing something or behaving not in the manner consistent with their education, protocols, and licensure, your responsibility is to raise your hand and say, hey, I don't think it's intentional. They always start their IV with the bevel side down. And that's terrible and excruciating for the patients, and it's not appropriate, and they won't listen to me. So can you please, whoever, help with this situation? So you have to keep bringing it up. And that's a level of responsibility for everyone, right? The physicians who give orders over the radio, for the agency directors who are saying, hey, go on that call even though your oxygen tank is empty. All of that is a shared responsibility, and everybody has a responsibility to raise their hand and say, this is not a good idea. This is scary and unsafe.
Well, that is a great transition to now talking about what the best practices are for an EMS provider or even an agency that should adhere to after making a mistake or breaking a law or a rule during an incident or on duty. I think you've conveyed that errors happen. And when they make their way to a state EMS office, I know you're not speaking for every state office in the United States, but I'm going to speak in generalities here and say that probably there are Emilys throughout the United States that look at it in a similar fashion of, these are humans. There's probably a root cause. So let's do a root cause analysis and not just put all the blame on one rule. So technically this person is in trouble. That's not what this is. This is identifying the fundamental root causes of problems, highlighting them and fixing them however they need to be fixed. So let's talk about the process for an EMS provider agency. The mistake happened. What are the best practices from your perspective at a state office that agency or person should do?
So I'm going to be very broad in what I say about, we'll talk about clinical first, and then we'll talk about criminal, because that's a little bit different depending on if in jail or not. The clinical pieces, it's about the gravity of the situation. So let's say, for example, this is an old wives' tale, and I don't even really know if it happened. The patient was on a drip, and you didn't notice that the drip was not running appropriately, and all of a sudden you realize the whole medicine bag is gone. That's a pretty significant issue. And no, I didn't really see that in real life. I just, that was one of the medication error ones that someone used in class with me. What was it? Was it normal saline? If it's normal saline, then you can probably just tell them at the hospital, like, hey, just so you know, they were supposed to be at 100 milliliters an hour, and I wasn't, something happened, and now they've had a liter in 30 minutes.
And you showed that you checked lungs, you looked at things,
right,
that
exactly.
Potential problem, you identified
so far I haven't
right.
seen any major outcomes that are bad because of it. I auscultated, I paid attention, they don't seem to be in fluid overload, their blood pressure is good, everything's fine, but just for reference, fluid in, fluid out, they had a liter of fluid in 30 minutes. You just let them know, you document it in your report, don't lie about it, document it in your report. Some MCAs have a near miss or a reporting tool. Let them know. Do you have to call the state office and tell them that you gave an extra liter of normal saline? No, you do not. But you do have to tell people that you did it, document it in your report, and be honest about it.
And I think from a state by state, county by county, agency by agency basis, look at your protocols and procedures for your specific geographic area on what you have to report.
Right.
But I think what you're saying is here is you got to pass it along in the best interest of the patient. Like, hey, this happened. What are things we can do to prevent it? And I think sometimes that's how pumps end up in EMS rigs or even in hospitals because errors happen.
So gravity fed medicines, it's one of the most amazing things to me, like that we ever did it that way, where, dopamine was
count the drips.
And you're, somebody's holding it like this, and then you put it on the IV pole. Well, that changes the rate.
And then one guy's squeezing it, one guy's not.
Exactly.
Depending on what the situation is.
There's a whole lot of, the arms this way, the arms this way. It's just yikes. But that is something that you have to, pay attention. If you are running a medication at some given rate in the back of your truck, when you get there, pay attention to what was actually given. Don't just go, okay, I ran it at this rate and everything's fine. Verify, right? That's part of your reassessment. That's kind of an aside clinical sidebar. But so that's for your, what I'm going to call relatively minor things, but still have to be honest about. It happened, learn from that mistake, let people know, put it in your report, etc.
Let's call that a no harm, no foul. Right. But what if there is harm?
Or potential harm, right?
Yeah, something a little bit harder that we don't know the outcome yet, or that it could have been a potential danger or get more dangerous than a leader.
Oh, so here's, we'll say, let's do a weight-based medicine error. We'll use ketamine, for example, because that one's new and it's kind of hard. And everybody's like, a little bit about it. It's kind of scary. So let's say you forget to convert pounds to kilograms and you dose according to their weight in pounds instead of their weight in kilograms. I can nearly guarantee you are going to see some adverse effects. There's going to be some adverse effects. The patient is going to probably have a dissociative reaction. They could have some significant drooling type problems. And there's a kind of a gradient there for how different patients react to that medicine. But this is a significant thing. You gave 2.2 times more than what you should have given of a medicine that has a significant side effect profile and a relatively small therapeutic threshold. It's a pretty big thing. So first and foremost, if you realize once you're pushing half of it in because you're supposed to push it really, really slow, stop pushing it. Stop doing whatever it is that you're doing. But if you don't, if it's already gone and you think about it after the fact, or your patient starts to go into the drain, do what you can to rectify the situation, right? Calm your patient, help their ventilations, put them on oxygen, do what you have to do to get them through. Fortunately, medications have half-lives. That's okay.
The nice part of a patient going downhill after you did something is at least
probably related to what you did. Exactly. So do what you can to rectify it. It's kind of like the same, I gave a medicine that the patient was allergic to. I didn't ask allergies. This is another one. I didn't ask allergies. And so I gave them a medicine and they had an allergic reaction. First and foremost, treat what you did. Treat your patient, take care of them appropriately. Don't just panic and freeze up. Do the things you know how to do to rectify the situation that you're in. And then with these ones, you need to notify the hospital, obviously, the care team that's taking care of that patient. You need to notify your agency leadership. You need to notify your MCA. Your MCA will notify the state office if they need to. You don't have to come directly to us about clinical things. That's your MCA does your quality improvement technically. They can take care of it. Can you, as a provider, if you see something and you're concerned about how your MCA handles things, I'm not talking about any specific MCA, or you don't feel comfortable with them, can you come to our office? Yes, you absolutely can. And we will work through the process on your behalf. You can even do it anonymously if you want to, but that's an immediate report. You need to immediately say, this happened. Hopefully you're sorry. This is why I think it happened.
So you're pointing out a line of demarcation of when it gets reported. And that's a big one for a lot of people of at an agency level. They say, hey, Jeff, I talk to people all over the state of Michigan. I talk to people all over the country. I think the number one thing that I hear in general when there's an incident going on somewhere is, hey, I'm hearing my agency should have said this or done this during this process. Should I have? And it's man, that's a gray area. If you think something is big enough where it needs to go up the chain of command, send it up.
Yeah,
I mean,
it is
why
always
not?
better to err on the side of you're reporting too many things. And if Erica Hendy hears this podcast, she will kick me for saying that because she's like our triage officer for complaints and compliance.
Right.
So
Yeah.
she has
As the guy
to,
who does that at Med Control, I feel for you, Erica. We're doing our best, Oakland. Okay. Sorry.
She's always like, I have another one for you or whatever. But
Right.
It is so much better for us to think that you're overcautious than flippant.
So that probably really helps out the provider and or the agency or the spectrum of people that probably were the root cause of the problem in a criminal matter.
Right.
So
Yes.
can you describe the difference for the criminal side of this?
Technically, you have 24 hours to report an arrest or whatever. And we understand, for example, you might be in jail. But some people have had their attorneys contact our office and say, hey, my client is in jail, and they're supposed to notify you. And sometimes the attorneys just say that and nothing more. And sometimes the attorneys say, do we need to send a letter? Fill in the blank. If you don't notify, it is an immediate level 1 infraction. You have to notify within 24 hours. And it's okay if it's your attorney, and it's okay if it's via email. But here's the thing. If you have been arrested and you went to jail and you're just going to go back to work and not say anything to anyone, that's a pretty significant problem that people will not be pleased about. Like, I can tell you, we had an employee of our office that went somewhere and a provider had a tether on their leg. And obviously that raised a few red flags. Why is there a person with a tether working on an ambulance? And then it came out that that person not only was working on a tether, but they had never even reported that they had the conviction that led to the tether. There's not a lot of empathy when you cover it up or attempt to cover it up or try to be secretive about it. Things happen. I have quite a few acquaintances who have had OUILs, driving under the influence. And yeah, we're probably going to put you on a consent order. And we're going to ask you to go through certain processes to help ensure that you're on the right path. But that doesn't mean you can't work, ever.
Now, you just mentioned a term that I would like to make people familiar with, and many other states probably have something as a consent order. Can you give us a little background on what that means? Because if you do find people in this type of situation, the tangible outcome might be a consent order or an order of disciplinary action. They're different. They're very different. And they sound very official. So please lighten it up for people listening of what it really means.
So an order of disciplinary action comes from your medical control authority, and it can encompass all sorts of different things. An order of disciplinary action will lay out different things. It might be a suspension or probation or remediation, etc. So an order of disciplinary action in an MCA is a very broad term. For us in the state office, a consent order is, in my agency, we call it the performance improvement plan. That's my closest line to it. And what that means is that you are saying, and we are saying, yes, this bad thing, whatever it is, happened, and these are the things that have to happen in order for that thing to get put to rest. So it's a legally binding agreement that is signed by our office and the people/persons involved. Everybody gets their own special one, where we ask you to do certain things. So it could be take a class. It could be take a lot of classes. It could be run reviews for a year. It could be read a book. I sign books a lot. Write a paper. We've had a lot of people give us presentations. So you don't have a strong understanding of abdominal pain patients. So we want you to give us an hour-long ALS level presentation of assessment treatment of abdominal pain patients in EMS. You've never covered that in an hour, but you get what I'm saying. All of those things could be inside of that. On the criminal side, it can be like drug and alcohol testing. It can be, we sent people to therapy, counseling, anger management. I mean, it's a lot of different things for that order to be completed. And once the order is completed, it goes in your file, right? It doesn't go away, but it goes in your file and you get your license back without restrictions. And that's kind of how that works.
Okay, that seems fair enough. At least you have a tangible arm that says, here's what we have to do. Here's the record maintenance system, and we have to identify trends of people that make errors.
Right.
Okay, that seems, reasonable and honest and accountable for somebody that we're allowing to walk into people's homes that are having the worst day of their life potentially.
Right. So this is our responsibility. This goes back to responsibility. So once we know in our office that Bud's ambulance service has an issue with documentation, and we don't actually have any idea what Bud's ambulance service is doing any day, even though legally it says we're responsible for collecting that information, we have to at least attempt to rectify that situation. Or if something happens bad at Bud's ambulance service or is repeatedly happening bad and we didn't pay any attention to it because we weren't getting their data in the first place, we're in trouble too.
Right, and you're taking more of an ownership stance rather than a liability stance. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, it is a liability.
I know. No.
Yeah.
But I think my intrinsic motivation comes from the responsibility of it rather than,
right.
Because I hate when people, we have to because it's the law. Because then you're diffusing the responsibility of it. No, we all have ownership of it. Let's not talk about the they that aren't here and put it on them. Let's talk about the fact that we can make it better.
Yeah, it's our system. Right. And I think that's really, a special thing about our office. And people are like, oh, Emily really thinks that I've had my license for a while and I saw our office before, which I call the license generating machine. Like I got my license, I got audited sometimes,
right?
Whatever. But our current leadership is really focused on us actually supporting and being a part of the system, which is why we are all licensed EMS providers. We have all come from, I spent 17 years on an ambulance before I came into this office. So we do understand the actual work and we do feel responsible for it. These are you're my people. You're my people. I care about the system. I care about the people who work inside the system. And I care about the patients that you all continue to care for. So that is, I think, something that's special. And I think that's what people need to understand about us. We're not coming to get you because we're mean and we're regulatory. I don't like it when people say, well, you're regulatory. Well,
yeah, I hate that.
Technically.
Yeah, that's they have to give me a job description. And yes, there has to be a root analysis of what I do. But at the same time, who I am and how I go about doing it can be from an effective point of view of support.
Right. And I can tell you that, can I write a cease and desist letter? Sure.
Yeah.
You can.
You want me to. You want me to be good at that.
Right.
If I need people to cease and desist, right?
But I don't like to, and I really try not to have to.
I think you're lying. I bet you once in a while you don't hate a letter you're writing to make somebody stop doing something because they're doing something wrong. But again, that speaks to the intrinsic motivation of this is bad. This has to stop. Let's make it better.
Yeah. And we usually try with at first, like, okay, well, let's see. And sometimes we can't. Like sometimes there are things that are egregious, right? So like you sexually assaulted your patient. Right. Like that's egregious. That's way out there. Yeah. Like I don't know.
Yeah, we don't even need to talk about that, right? That's
exactly.
just
like that one's so far out there that we're just not. But there are situations where like you punched a patient.
Well, what's the context? Did he have a knife and was attacking me?
That happened because it is not an automatic revocation because you punched a patient. Like, are you going to get suspended? Sure, you're going to get suspended, at least for a little while until we figure out why it happened and how can we rectify it. What was the precipitating situation in which you felt that punching a patient was a good idea? Did you get into a situation where you didn't have a patient appropriately cared for before you got into the back of the ambulance? Whatever it is, that's where we're going to go and say, okay, is it something that you punched a patient because it's your ex-wife's mom, your ex-mother-in-law, and you punched them because you don't like them? Okay, that is going to get you in more trouble than if your patient came after your partner and you punched them instinctively. And all of that, there's a whole bunch of gradient, and we will try to tailor what has to be done to the situation. It's not a blanket.
So Michigan looks at the root cause and the balance of the actual problem and how to fix it. So in my opinion, personally, when we have problems that occur on a call, most of them should be or could be fixed with prevention. And in my opinion, prevention is in the form of number one, like I said, open and honest, reasonable and accountable dialogue that also allows you to have a process that is patient-centered QI process, not a process that gets people in trouble, not a process aimed at identifying specific people or singling them out, but one that identifies patient outcomes and how we can make them better. And then identifying, do we have protocol compliance? And to tack onto that, a lot of people say, well, protocols. Well, if you don't like a protocol, guess what? There's a process to fix the protocol. And if you're smarter and you think you can make it better, nobody's going to turn you away.
Send us an email. So, honest to God. So many protocols have changes that have come from actual providers, humans.
Right. And so a lot of times I see frustrated people end up in these situations where there either wasn't a QA/QI program that they felt was accountable or reasonable and didn't have dialogue with whoever's doing a QI program. Sometimes we find out there wasn't even a QI program, and these people are just being told, hey, follow your protocols. Then once in a while, really the only QI program is having the next level or an MCA or a state investigated. And that doesn't seem really appropriate,
right. It doesn't feel like, I think that's why people are so averse to it, right? If the only time they've ever looked at a run is when they're in big enough trouble that they're, seeing the big bad state office.
Or the med control.
It's like we get complaints in our office, like direct complaints from citizens sometimes. And a lot of those complaints say, and this is, I know we're running short on time, Jeff, but a lot of those complaints will say, I tried to talk to the agency and they didn't listen to me. That says a lot, right? Most of them are not completely unfounded. Are they all clinical? No. Some of them are really poor customer service. Do not get me wrong. Some of them clinically, they look fine, but they look really bad customer service wise. But when a patient or a family member, whoever comes to your agency or you, if we as an agency go and say, okay, that's we're going to talk and we're going to work through it inside, it doesn't ever escalate to us.
Most of the time it's handled directly and they're listening to what they want.
Because they feel
what the problem
valued
is and handle it.
And cared for and like an actual piece of their own medical care.
And that probably happens a lot where you get this person that comes in and they get to talk to the EMS captain, coordinator, whatever, process improvement person, maybe even a chief, a CEO, administration, whatever. And they are like, thank you so much. Thank you for clarifying this. That probably happens a lot. But the problem is when it doesn't happen, there's a million different reasons that the patient ended up saying, you know what, I'm just turning it into the state. And sometimes, and I have seen these happen, and I've seen everything between this person is a little bit for peculiar.
Sure.
And sometimes like, man, I feel really bad for this person. And they're right. And that can happen.
I mean, for sure, I'm not saying that everyone could be handled before it gets to us, because some people are just, you can't please them. Like there are some people.
But if it got to you, there's a reason.
Right.
And you have to identify how it got to you and why, which may not be the fault of the patient or the agency. But
it could be either way. And that's, I think, an important thing to realize. I want people to understand is that good clinical care also pairs with good customer service. And people can argue with me about this. If you read the Wednesday updates, I know some people are from out of state, but if you read our Wednesday updates, I write about this a lot. Like a good clinician is not somebody who treats everyone like a machine. And if you do that, if you treat a patient in that way, you're going to have a hard time. We're not the judge and jury, I guess. It's the patient's emergency, not my emergency. And that means a lot of things. Like just because I don't think it's that bad doesn't mean they don't feel like it's that bad. And that there's a lot that's kind of unwrapped in that. All sorts of things get uncovered. It's like nearly any complaint that we get, the documentation is terrible.
I find that a lot of times that I find these common things. Number one, documentation. When something becomes an incident, a lot of times the documentation wasn't good. The communication between all of the providers in the spectrum, the continuum of care wasn't good. The interaction at the hospital between EMS and the ED personnel. And then the interaction between personnel and the people that run the agency.
Mm-hmm.
That sometimes, that friction, that lack of communication creates these problems, or at least allows these problems to lie in wait to a degree of which they become common. Right.
It's agency to agency, it's provider to provider, and you will see, well, we will see, maybe not the collective you, but I can see it. Like, I know exactly how that happened. You know, like, you don't work well with this person and you don't work well with this person and you don't feel valued by that person up there and you think that that person's out to get you. And so you focus only on the things that you can control and the rest of it is just, you know, around you. Well, the second that you need to actually have a support system and have a check and balance, then the whole thing falls apart. It's really a symbiotic relationship between all of the players in the EMS system. And that's why I think we're so closely bound together. But it's also why when things go awry, they go very awry.
So, in closing, there are many people listening right now that are lucky enough that they and or their agency have not had to go through any part of this. So can you give those people listening and anybody else listening really some advice? Can you give those, our audience members listening right now who may be trying to consider how to update their processes and things related to this? Can you give them some tips on best practices for preventing any type of clinical or criminal problem during an incident?
So prevention is an action. It's not an inaction. I can't, as an EMS provider, as a clinician who practices emergency medical services, go to work every single day and never read an article and not pick up a book and only glance at the protocols when I have to on the way to a call with an app, expect to not have a curveball that's going to trip me up. It is an active thing. Think about your calls, review your calls with your partners, read articles, look at books, read the Wednesday updates. If you haven't attended literally all of our state offices' free EMS CEs, your MCA's free CEs, those are oftentimes the most timely, the most up-to-date, and the most relevant things that you can intake into your system. So you're listening to this podcast, so you probably listen to this podcast, but I encourage you to reach out and find other things. Look at other states' websites, look at other areas, best practices, check things out. And I mean, I can only monitor so many things. So if you see something and you're like, hey, this is really cool, let's do this, that helps you engage in the system. Be engaged. Prevention is an action. It's not an inaction. Do things to keep yourself up to date. That's my best description of how to prevent this from happening, is to be present.
Would you say that the you can be used as a provider, a set of providers, an agency, a med control,
for sure,
or a state?
Yeah. For example, I have a membership in the National Association of EMS Physicians, and I get their journal, which is literally a journal. It's not like the GEMS journal. It's like a hardbound thing that comes, and it has all of these scholarly articles and research. And because we, the collective us, the state office, wants you, the collective EMS system, to be able to do the best things that are available, that we can enable you to be able to do. And so we read and we think about and we explore and we contemplate the feasibility in our system and the safety for our patients and the benefit, all of that. That's my prevention, right? From our system becoming stagnant and the same old. That's my prevention. And everybody's piece is going to be a little bit different. We rewrote the documentation protocol. There's going to be a webinar that goes over that documentation protocol to try to raise the level, because I know now there is a problem. There's a documentation problem, and it goes from medical first responders all the way up through medical control authorities. Some MCAs have never logged into the system. Oh my God. Some MFRs have never written an actual report. These are all things that now I know. So now my responsibility is to help get the tools out there to help that. That's prevention.
Well said. Emily, thank you very much for your time. We're going to have her back. You're going to find her email in the episode description. We're going to be talking to her a lot more because in 2021, you're going to see a huge focus in the next couple of months in our topics into EMS documentation, QA/QI programs, prevention, things that can support an agency and personnel into just knowing where their agency stands and how to do process improvement, because not everybody's on the same page of what that means.
Excellent.
So thank you
Thanks,
again,
Jeff.
Emily.
Thanks for having me.
See
I'll
you.
talk to you soon. All right, bye.
All right, beat it. That's all for the show today, everyone. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Emily Berquist for coming on the show and spreading your knowledge. Your time and participation is always appreciated and never wasted. Please keep emailing your questions, comments, feedback, and episode ideas to the EMS On Air podcast team by email at qi@ocmca.org. Also, check out our website, emsonair.com, for the latest information, podcast episodes, and other details. Follow us on Instagram at EMSOnAir. And please, whatever podcast platform you use, subscribe to our podcast and leave us a rating and a review. It really helps us to grow this project. Thank you for listening to the EMS On Air podcast. Stay safe and have a great day.